Preeti ji, we are done. And before Preeti ji say anything, I would request every participant in today's beautiful session, please remain muted until or unless you've been specifically asked for. Thank you. Yeah, Preeti ji.
Good evening and welcome to Maja House, even though it's online Maja House and you're not really here. I am sitting here in Amritsar, however, and the weather's really pleasant outside. I wanted to tell you about some of the books and the ideas that we're going to be talking about in April. But before doing that, today we are talking about a rather unique and compelling travelogue. This has been written by Suhaash Munshi, who's here with us today. Suhaash is a journalist and he's been reporting out of Kashmir for the last more than 10 years, reporting on politics, on culture, and on conflict, not just in J&K, but also in other parts of the country. He's, of course, Kashmiri, he's a Pandit. And this fairly unique kind of travelogue, because I found it really enthralling to read, because it brought so many insights into the people of Kashmir and into their everyday lives that one had no idea about. As he says, that you either think of Kashmir as a heaven, or then it's this hellish place where lots of atrocity.
Biscuit hai,
But but in this, he actually talks about going to Kashmir in early August in 2019, and then he finds that there are soldiers everywhere. There's curfew suddenly, and Article 370 is abrogated. It's his first book, and as he travels through North Kashmir, South Kashmir, Srinagar, and also does this really long, grueling walk with the Bakarwals, we can see the lives of the ordinary people and what they're going through in these very extraordinary circumstances that they've been placed in. Talking to him today, we have Bani Gill. She's a researcher, postdoctoral researcher at the University of Oxford, and she has long years of work on migration and on the idea of home and exile and what this means. I think we should have an interesting conversation spanning lots of the issues that come up in the book. Suhaash also actually takes us to really unexpected places. We go into the homes of poets and scholars and performers. He gets us to meet football enthusiasts in Srinagar. We also attend a Christmas service in Baramulla. And he finds a lone Pandit family living in a largely abandoned ghost colony in Shopian. I think around 5 years back, we had gone to Shopian, to the high mountains covered with snow in Peer Ki Gali. And of course, we'd visited Srinagar and Gulmarg, etc. And I found that the entire trip was heartbreaking. The beauty, the ethereal, unreal beauty of Dal Lake, the mountains surrounding it, and the harshness. I mean, unbearable to see so many soldiers, so much security over there, terrible poverty. And as we traveled through the villages, you saw these scarred hillsides and bombed out sort of houses. It's like an ongoing tragedy. So let's listen to both of them today. Let's listen to Suhaash and all his experiences and the people that he met. Over to you now, Bani. Thank you both for being here today.
Great. Thanks for inviting me, Preeti, and thank you, Maja House. And a big thank you to SUHAS MUNSHI for penning this wonderfully kind of poignant account of Kashmir, its people, and its cultures. So Suhas's book is called This World Below Zero Fahrenheit, Travels in the Kashmir Valley. And as Preeti just said, it's kind of set up as a travelogue, but it is also so much more than just a travelogue. It's really a kind of a memoir of the people there in context of Kashmir's history and Kashmir's present. And the book has some beautifully written lines and beautiful descriptions. and engages with various historical, archival, literary, and visual representations of Kashmir, thereby presenting before us a really rich kind of portrait of the many cultures and the many people that inhabit the valley. Suhas really takes us into the alleys and corners of Kashmir and engages with a vast demographic of people, ranging from poets and playwrights and performers to, as Preeti just mentioned, elderly people hanging out in a football stadium, and kind of brings to light the love for football that Kashmiris have had and so on. And in this way, it's really a socio-cultural engagement with Kashmir, a land that is very often stuck between these tropes of either being an earthly paradise or being a living hell. And this is actually where I want to begin our conversation with with you, Suhas. You write in the book, you begin, by quoting a friend of yours who says that, quote, Kashmir is not a goddamn heaven. So what did they mean by that? Why do they say that? And what do you think of this all too simplistic characterization of Kashmir between these kind of binaries,
When I got this phone call from a friend, it came up from a point of deep anguish. Is because when you see your home being written about or talked about in not only simplistic but in such derogatory words, phrases, it pains you because it almost these phrases, these generalisms are meant to sort of take the people out in a way from the place which is there, for the taking, it seems, in the grand scheme of geopolitical whatever events. But the people are always left behind. It was just from a point of deep anguish. He called me. He said, yet again, I wake up this morning to read this banality again, and in which they're calling it, whatever paradise or whatever. But we are living people. We are not dead. It's not a paradise, really. I mean, so just why don't they just stop doing that? So I mean, there was it was a lesson that stuck to me, although I didn't at that point feel that I'd sort of expand on this theme and write more about it. But it did stick with me because it was very instructive of how these generalizations or these cliches were corrupting and were corrupting and were disrupting the local people. They were offending them very deeply, and so it was a very instructive thing. And one idea behind writing this book was to show that it's a place like like the places we inhabit. It's like our neighborhood. It's not a very exotic sort of different place where people are carrying guns all the time or are just violent or thinking about violence. They're just doing their 9-to-5 jobs. They have very simple aspirations also. So, and it's a very, like any other place, it's very layered and complex, and can't be encapsulated in a word or a phrase.
No, yeah, I really appreciate that perspective. And in fact, I think you've also kind of brought this perspective into the very title of the book. You've steered clear from like these very commonsensical understandings of Kashmir, and you titled the book This World Below Zero Fahrenheit. So where does the inspiration for the title come from?
It comes from a poem by Agha Shahid Ali. It's from one of his poems called "The City of Daughters," and I mean the Agha Shahid Ali is sort of about whom I write sort of its in sort of bickering tones is a figure that really introduced me to Kashmir in a way that wasn't accessible to me when he writes about. I mean, it's sort of very inclusive when he writes about such shared pleasures like Begum Akhtar or things, which I didn't know. I thought they were only a rage in our house, and then my maternal side, my paternal side, everyone I knew, they're sort of mad about her. And then I read how obsessively he writes about her, and then sort of very incrementally, I understand how much shared love there is culturally, how much we have in common. and then he writes about the wave of assaults on Kashmir and Kashmiris, and how Kashmir is reduced to dust and ash by these cycles of violence, and that sort of taught me so much about which 100 journalism books couldn't, about how his favorite haunts, his places, favorite places, friends, how he saw them wither away. And so Aga Shahid Ali has been sort of really a very has been a literary hero of mine, and so this comes from one of his poems.
It's a very, very evocative title. Good title. So Suhas, you've had a long career as a journalist, and this is your first book. So why and how the transition from being a journalist to being an author, and why did you choose to write a book to begin with, and why a book on Kashmir?
Part of the reason for coming to this profession was to understand the tropes of writing, basic flexing muscles, literary muscles, to understand how basic sentence formation, etc., happens. Because I always wanted to write a book, sort of very childish impulse, and it was just there. It's sort of Martin Amis, this British author, says that it's like every child wants to write, but some people never grow out of that impulse. So anyways, it was always there. I wanted to write for some reason, and so being a journalist, I thought, was the first step towards learning how to write. And because a lot of writers I admire began their career being a journalist, and so that's how it began. And then it also, this journalism gave me excuse to travel to Kashmir repeatedly, to understand major events that were going around, violence or cultural even, and to interact with people over a length of time, to see how they themselves were being changed by these events. And so why a book on Kashmir is because as I said, I wanted to write a book always, and the subject had to be Kashmir because that's what I obsessively thought about for the better part of my adult life, in a sense that I grew up in the backdrop of this image that I had built in my mind of our home in Kashmir, that my elders had painted for me, that we had this home in Kashmir. And I was too young. I was 3 years old when we came here. But so they told me this is how the mohalla used to be, and 2 steps left to right, there used to be a liquor shop, and there used to be this very thriving old market somewhere. And then anyway, so this is what I grew up listening over time, and every time, often in the evenings, we would sit down, and the elders, would say that they would round up all the children, and they sort of drone on about this, that our house in Kashmir, what it was. You guys have seen nothing. We'll tell you what culture is, what house is like. And anyway, so this was sort of repetitive, sort of this thing I kept hearing. And so when I decided to write a book, I knew it had to be on Kashmir. And so I might have digressed from what you'd asked me.
No, not at all. All of this is very interesting to know the process behind writing the book and why about Kashmir. Because in the book, you mentioned that when you had this idea, you didn't particularly have a connecting theme in mind.
Yes.
You just knew that you didn't want to write about violence. And then
Yes.
you cheekily observed that you didn't succeed in doing that either. But was that hard to do in a way, to engage with Kashmir without really explicitly engaging with the politics and the violence there, or
I think in my case it was necessary because I've written a bit about it in form of stories. The one thing I realized, as I say, is that violence has a tendency to eclipse everything else. And what I did not want to write, and what I feel very strongly is that if you do mention violence or describe violence that has happened, it sort of becomes slightly pornographic in nature, by which I mean it sort of serves the perpetrator, because the perpetrator, whoever committed these gory acts, it dehumanizes the victims. By which I don't mean that violence shouldn't be talked about. Of course it should be, but I mean, it's a very tricky thing to handle. It's because if you, and if you describe a very gory violent scene, and then the perverse mind of some people, if their appetite is only whetted and then you want something more, because then you start comparing incidents of violence, but this is not as gory as that one. So why don't you sort of explain in greater detail, or try and give a more comprehensive idea of how exactly grisly or gory this crime was. I mean to say that it sort of gets out of hand, and the idea shouldn't be to describe, I mean, the finer nuances of violence, I mean, but to suggest that violence did happen, and just to, in my case at least, I knew this is the only way I could deal with it, and because I just felt it sort of was very dehumanizing to the victims and to people who've seen this. They should not have to live this trauma of reading, great details about it. So anyways, it just gets out of the hand is my experience. And so I write that, there's one scene in this book, Valley of Saints, in which I say, for instance, that this character, they're getting bored, and it's sort of so wonderfully done, this scene, in which they say that, so this character is getting bored and he says, wait, I'll show you something. I'll do an act. And the act is that I'll show how people look like in their deaths. And this is you in death, and he does a sad face. And this is me in death, and he shows a perfectly sort of aligned body with a smile on his face. And how is a violent death, he asks, encounter death? And he shows this body with the shirt slightly put out around their waist, and the limbs at unnatural angles, and he stays there for a second, and in that one moment he becomes all the dead people, all the corpses of Kashmir. It was a very it was a moment of a minor inspiration for me, because he didn't have to show bodies in that 1 second, even through a mime. He sort of showed you what has happened over and over and over again in Kashmir. So to give a very long answer to your question, I meant that just mere suggestion of it, I thought was enough, and we didn't have to. We should sort of contain this thing, although we're not successful all the time.
No, I mean, I think what's interesting in your book is how you kind of do describe violence, but not just in terms of the physical acts of violence. It's this kind of slow degradation of a land because of the many things that have happened there and the events that have occurred there. So it is a description of the assault on the social-cultural history of Kashmir, beyond just this, physical kind of violence, but the other aspects of violence that affect people in their everyday lives. And in that context, I want to talk a bit about, you begin the novel when in the 24 hours before the abrogation of 370, when you were in Kashmir, and you describe the scene around you, and you can almost feel the anxiety that is there, the fear of something about to happen. I think you even describe it as, kind of waiting for a long migration, preparing for a long migration of sorts.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
what was that like? What was the feeling on the ground like when this was happening?
It was like, this writer Nabokov says, he describes what horror is. He says it's like waiting outside a dentist's office. In a way, it was I could sense that the Kashmiris there, they knew something very bad and terrible is happening. But what was even worse, that the people who had come there, and often it happens that you say such things with promises of solidarity or whatnot, that we're together or whatever, and then everyone is suddenly abandoning you, or at least they're making the government is making them go away, and suddenly you find that the dentist's office has nobody but you, and your appointment is almost certain, and whatever is going to happen, you're going to endure it alone. That was very painful. I felt that in those moments, after the abrogation of this article, as it was just a one-way communication, and Kashmiris would only sit and see people dancing and smiling, and over time only, because you couldn't participate, you couldn't even ask questions, because internet was down, only satellite TV was happening. So you could only receive information. And after a point, it became clear what was happening. And then there was a terribly long, prolonged period of internet blackout. But in that period, just before the curtain was lifted on why all this was happening, I felt that a lot of Kashmiris felt very lonely and abandoned, in a sense that because you don't know what's going to happen, and that waiting in itself is so painful. And because right now, in hindsight, we know 370 was abrogated. At those times, people were going mad because of all those rumors that were going on. There were rumors that India is going to war with Pakistan. There was rumors, all sorts of things. And so you didn't know. And then outside petrol stations, there were miles long queues. Everyone's honking. The whole Kashmir, it's like, you can't put people through that sort of trauma, repeatedly. It was very, very. And then on top of that, to show how, and on top of that, to see how everyone else, the tourists and everyone, they're being made to go back to their homes, and they're being ferried to the airport. As this taxi driver told me, who put his own life at great risk to get me to Srinagar. He said, "आप लोग जा रहे हो, देखना ये हम लोगों को मार देंगे, जान से मार देंगे." I mean, imagine. I mean, I don't know. Imagine in Delhi, everyone, or in Chandigarh or wherever, there's a government order, and they say everyone who's not from Chandigarh immediately leave. There's a lot of army, and just suddenly would the local people not panic? It was very mad. Although the taxi driver later apologized for it, he didn't have to, but he felt that he had just taken it out on a random stranger, and then he even offered me money. He said, "ATM's around, you should take some money from me. Just reach your home safely. I'm sorry." I said, that was how it was. It was very, very painful. And then even then, these Kashmiris won't stop surprising you with their generosity and kindness.
Right. I mean, that really speaks to kind of the humanity that is still ongoing, in Kashmir. So the abrogation of 370 happened, and then COVID happened, right? And then COVID also kind of made us rethink these notions of home. There were all this talk about stay at home, stay lives, but what does home really mean? Who has access to home? But specifically in context of Kashmir, have you been back since? And how has COVID impacted it? And what are the intersections between the curfew, the abrogation, COVID, and how that kind of exacerbates already existing hierarchies and structural inequalities within Kashmir?
I was there in August last year, 2020, just to see what's happened in 1 year since I left the place. And I spoke, although only on phone, because this person had contracted COVID, to Dr. Ejaz Ahmed Band. And there couldn't be a more striking example of how this place was safe spaces that were built inch by inch for the LGBT community in Kashmir. They were all brought down, by this gust of wind, typhoon rather. And he spoke at length about what sort of damage this had done, the dovetailing of COVID restrictions on the already existing restrictions because of 370, and how because you couldn't talk on phone to your partner, and it's one can't emphasize enough that such a sexual minority, which is already under so much threat, you take away their lifeline, which is internet, the only means of them communicating with each other and communicating with the rest of the world. You take that away, and they're at home, and the abuses increase at home, because outside they could go to colleges or schools or roam around, do whatever. The abuses increase, and it's so traumatic. Some people are taking hormone therapy or whatever, that abruptly comes to a halt, and it's just, for months you don't even know whether your partner is alive or dead, or there is no community basically, since you're restricted, and it just goes on and on, because you can't go out, and the whole it felt like a nightmare, is how he described to me. And I spoke to another journalist, Kuratul and Reber, who also told me about how it was. She said they worked like robots after 370 happened because they just felt that the stories of pain and anguish that they were hearing, they needed to report them religiously. And so she said, I was numb after a week. We just were just traveling, writing, speaking to people and writing. We felt that this is what we have to do. It was different ways people try to deal with it, but it was this internet ban. Some people have experienced, I think, in some ways, or shutouts. But and then there's a lot of outrage about how Vodafone or Airtel or whoever, they're not able to provide us good network or better service. And just one day or few hours of internet shutdown is enough to, and for good reasons, make people outraged so much about the inherent rights of people, etc. And here is a part of the world where it's just blackout for a year. It's just unbelievable. When some of my friends would come down to Delhi, they wouldn't be able to move their faces away from mobile screen for hours because they had this flood of stream of messages coming and so much catching up to do.
I think you really described well how curfews and military lockdowns and so on they're not just terms, they're things that affect people in very everyday ways, in very mundane things, in very kind of quotidian movements and so on. Just the act of walking, for instance, right? Like walking becomes almost a sign of resistance in some way. And talking about walking, we were actually talking about walking before the session started, and I'll come back to that. But your long walk with the Bakarwals was actually my favorite part of the book.
Thank you.
I think it's written with such empathy and humor, and I also really appreciate the fun that you're poking at your own self, at your own kind of privileged class position, and how you're engaging with violence and inequality of another kind, structural violence and of poverty. So tell us a bit more about the walk with the Bakarwals and how did people kind of perceive you, and why do you think, I mean, I know you had a very hard time getting that in with them, but then they did kind of accept you. So why do you think that is, and what was just that act of walking like?
It was quite a revelation, and I think, as I say, that one of the objectives I had in my mind as I was traveling with them was not just to register and draw individual sketches of these people, but also to register the difference in my own outlook by the end of the walk, how I myself had changed as a person. And I think it was quite instructive, those 3 weeks. For instance, when I as I say, for the first time I got to know what hunger is when you can't afford bread, what that sort of hunger is, and I mean, it was just I had never imagined to be sharing such a space with such people, and the love that they offered me. They didn't even know when they asked me what my name was. They just said, all right. As I say, this is exactly how the conversation unfolded as I write it, that this friend of mine sold to them this idea that I was a journalist, and it was not a complete lie, but it wasn't completely honest. He was being completely honest either, that he's going to write about you and describe how you live, and only then can he try and sort of push some structural positive changes around you. But and it was and they accepted me just like that, and only much later did they get to know who I am, what my background is, but it didn't even matter to them. And I don't know, I mean, would I do that? I don't know. If a random guy comes up to my door and he says, I want to live with you for 3 weeks and your family, and I don't know, I'd slam the door in his face, I think. Forget even bothering to check their credentials or whatever. So it was very gracious of them, and they taught me so much about the idea of home also, which to them I suppose was much more expansive and flexible, in a sense that when we were walking through these pathways through mountains. They were walking on land that their generations before them had walked, their fathers and their forefathers and their forefathers, and so they felt an ownership of these pathways even. And it was this, they camped with pride in such places, and it sort of was a revelation in that many things, many avenues sort of opened up for me, and they and how they treated their guests, and how abruptly they decided to end the relationship. Sort of slightly fickle minded, but it was I had great fun, and I'm not going to honk my car very loudly and impatiently behind a Bakarwal whenever I encounter one next. I can say, I don't know.
Right. So is the cover page the photograph from that walk? Or?
No, it's been arranged from. It's a stock photo, I think, taken from somewhere else. My photographs are there in the middle of the book, in those two pages.
Unfortunately, I didn't have the physical copy of the book, so I couldn't see. But then I'm going to hold you to that. I want a physical copy. Right. But anyway, so no, maybe we should read out an excerpt from the Walk with the Bakarwals. Perhaps you'd like to.
Sure. Yeah, I will. So this bit that I thought that we could talk about was. I'm sorry. This was from this. I talked a few lines about this person called Koka. She's the wife of Nazir, who's the second in command at the camp, and she is somebody who's very loving and caring to the point of self-effacement. But she has a very, very strong sense of personal space also. So this, I thought I'd just read a couple of paragraphs, there are excerpts from Rebecca West's book, which I'm going to skip over. So I'll just read 2-3 paragraphs. So this is how it is. Nazir is his husband. Nazir returned that evening with a new phone for himself and a pair of rubber shoes, polished to look like leather, for his elder son, Saji, who handed his worn-out shoes to Rashid. With a heated piece of metal, Rashid immediately began melting bits of the discarded shoes to fill in the blanks of his own shoes. Nobody at the camp ever discarded their worn-out shoes. They stored those pieces of rubber and with them mended their shoes, little ships of theses. With what looked like an early onset of buyer's remorse, Nazir handed his phone over to Koka, as if he were no longer interested in this expensive and unnecessary device, as if it were no longer filling him up with guilt. Both Nazir and Koka smiled at each other. He was allowed his indulgence. They fit together like a work of art, as West said of a Jewish couple she meets in Sarajevo. Nazir was a strongly built, tall man, almost resembling Balraj Sahni in 1961 black and white classic Kabuliwala. Koka was shorter, frailer, and unbearably kind. She had a beatific, disarming smile that could stop wars. It was certainly enough to subdue the anger of Nazir, who was the most feared in the commune after Majid. Though when Koka herself got angry, she would send her sons and husband flying for cover. To the demands of her family, to the whims of anyone around her, Koka was indulgent to the point of self-effacement. But she also had a strong sense of personal space. After putting her family to sleep, she would often stay by the dying kitchen fire, switch on the radio, and listen to a Pahari folk singer whose songs about solitude and separation were often broadcast at such hours. Sometimes in the dead of the night, she would also look up at the sky and softly converse with someone. Nobody found it odd. Perhaps in their own tents, everyone was privately speaking to the night sky. So,
thanks, Suhaash. I think we have, on popular demand, you're being asked to show the cover of the book. So perhaps you could hold it up for everyone. Yes, it's a beautiful picture. So Suhaash, I want to talk to you a little bit about your own kind of sense of home and association with Kashmir. You were born in Kashmir and then you left with your family in 1990 when many other Kashmiri Pandit families also did. So what is your sense of association with Kashmir? Do you identify it as home?
I think I do, and it's because I was born there, and I sense that I sense because we came to Delhi, and the rest of the family followed us in very urgent circumstances, and all we kept talking about was our place back home. So there was a dissociation growing up with the rest of the people, the rest of the culture around us. Seeing Holi or Diwali. Diwali, I think we did, but Holi for the first time. Such festivals to see how people around us behaved and the mannerisms. And coming from Kashmir always gave one that slight dissociation from the rest of the people, and that over time cemented further this idea that you didn't belong actually to this place. You came from somewhere else because you saw friends at your school speaking in their own languages, and that made you think that you don't come from their part of the world. You come from somewhere and you have your own language, and so on and so forth. And so over time, I kept reading about it, and as soon as I could, I started traveling to that place. And the more I traveled, the more I realized how quite naturally like home it felt. Quite instinctively at home I felt when I was in Kashmir. Even I didn't even have to meet anyone. When I landed at the airport, I could just sense that this is something. I could be slightly corny and say that I could be blindfolded and put on a Kashmiri tarmac, and I could tell you that I'm here. I don't know. I mean, so the thing is that there was this scene, and the fact, as I say, that my parents, as happened to many other children, they stopped speaking to them in Kashmiri, so that they could encourage them to speak only in Hindi or English and not be very provincial and take the world on at its own terms. Gradually, you realize that you're missing out on so much, that the only vehicle of passing on your culture, which was language, stopped at you, because at with you could understand the language, but because you weren't spoken to, you couldn't speak it back. But now you realize how a vital and important link you are, because after you not going to be able to pass on the cultural wealth that you inherited, and so it's going to stop with you, and so much is going to stop with you. I mean, it's not a. It happens all around the world. We're not the only people to feel it, but one can't stop sensing that personal loss that is inevitable, and that's sort of that we are hurtling along towards. That something is going to be irrevocably lost with us, and so the more that idea cemented itself in my mind, the more voraciously I started reading in Kashmiri. I started speaking to some friends also, to my great embarrassment, in Kashmiri. Started learning the language at whatever cost I could, and started engaging with the place, and I mean, in whatever cultural manner I could explore the cultural wealth of our, or the place where we come from. And I sort of, because the thing is, if some successive generations or some young people that I see, it's not a blanket statement for all Kashmiri Pandit young generation, but I'm just out of personal experience. So there's some kids, they have gone to Kashmir, but they go there as tourists, and so you can already see a disconnect happening, a very great disconnect, and so that makes you want to immerse yourself even more deeply into this place, and
No, absolutely. I think in your book as well, you write about how exile and exodus has meant different things to different people, and then you kind of bring forward that for you it has meant this loss of language and the impact that this would have on future generations as well. I mean, that's a really wonderful line that you have there about the differential experiences of exodus and exile. Would you like to read out a bit about that, or there was this other? Yeah.
We could skip if I mean I don't know how we are doing on time. So
I think we're okay. We have about 5-10 minutes more, if you'd like to. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So there was this this bit. It was actually a Kashmiri Sikh gentleman that I met on a train, and when he spoke the language, because growing up I hadn't seen Kashmiri Sikh people speaking in Kashmiri. I always in my mind I had this, just as I hadn't seen young children speak Kashmiri, because nobody of my age spoke Kashmiri. And so when I went to Kashmir, I saw young kids chirruping in Kashmiri and suddenly realized it's not a language meant for only elders. And so this person made me realize what we had lost and so on and so forth. I'm going to quickly read out a paragraph from this chapter on the train, A Train to the Past. Vasant Shubh, Sanjeet Singh Sodhi asked two young girls wearing hijabs whether they meant to get down from the train. That is, the train was about to enter the railway station at Sopore. The two nodded, stood up, and walked towards the door, where they joined the long queue of other passengers waiting to get off, while we took their seats. It was not the first time I'd heard a Sikh speaking Kashmiri, but every time it sounds a bit strange, maybe because I grew up without hearing or seeing any Kashmiri Sikh speak the language. It seems surprising the same way that very young children talking in Kashmiri used to surprise me. When some 7 years ago, for the first time, I heard a little boy chatter in Kashmiri, I felt a sense of wonder. I heard, having grown up in a family that did not encourage its children to speak in Kashmiri, I had somehow related the speaking of it only with adults. It hadn't occurred to me that children could exchange private jokes in it, that they could sing songs in Kashmiri. After our exodus, some Pandit families had decided to speak to their children in Hindi and English to give them a metropolitan upbringing. Times were tough. The displaced families counted on their children to shed their provincial ways and compete with the world on equal terms. While it became easier for us to catch up with the rest of the classroom, we lost the only vehicle through which age-old traditions and culture could be acquired, practiced, and passed on. Exodus has meant different things to different people. Those of us who can see the sunset on our culture, who can see within our own lifetimes our culture drawing nearer towards the darkness into which many civilizations, languages, and traditions have disappeared forever, live with a hopelessness that is hard to express. But Pandits have been through much worse. We have seen the reign of tyrants, natural disasters like floods, famines, and spells of cholera, and yet here we are.
Thanks, Suhas. We have about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to ask you a bit about the making of the book and your method. So, of course, you were traveling through Kashmir, and then you must have met very many people, some of whose stories and narratives you've included in the book. So, what was that selection process like, and how did you choose which stories to kind of, which ones would make it in this book?
It was based on the sort of opinions that I received from them, in a sense that with old people it was very easy. Whatever they said was so valuable. I felt instinctively like preserving whatever they were saying, because I knew that they're not going to stick around forever, and they've seen a past that was a shared past, and that sort of was so common to a lot of us. Unlike today, when many Kashmiri young Pandits haven't seen or met Kashmiri Muslims and vice versa. And so that was there. But then whenever anyone had a very strong personality and views, which I thought I didn't agree with, but they were bringing their own perspective and adding something else to what was being said. In the sense, the children's magazine editor was sort of doing very remarkable work. It interested me very immensely. What sort of literature was he producing for children who growing up with seeing such mind-numbing violence? And similarly, a young journalist that I've talked about, Ijaz Ahmed Band, an LGBT rights activist, and so many other people. The lone Kashmiri Pandit, for instance, made for a good story, I thought, because he's living in a part of Kashmir where you don't expect to find Pandits, and that ghost town is hard to describe, because it's it at the same time you can see the past and the present in that one scene where you see abandoned houses that are crumbling down, and then in one house this guy is still living. And so the selection procedure was such that there had to be an individual voice, and it didn't matter whether I agreed with it or not, but I thought if it's a strong voice, you should have it.
Now that's interesting. It also comes across as very organic. I mean, some encounters were quite by chance. The Sikh gentleman that you mentioned, you just happened to kind of meet him and struck up that conversation. And that's also really interesting to see how you get an insight into such experiences in very unplanned kinds of ways. Things just happen. That's what life is in a way.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you a bit about your own positionality, actually. How were you perceived by the people with your Kashmiri Pandit background? How were you perceived by the people, and how were you also perceived by actors of the state, by the military and so on? Or you must have had encounters through your journalistic career in any case. So.
Yeah, I mean, see, with local people, it's very easy. There's mostly there's just warmth and love, and sometimes there's a very irritating throat clearing in that we guys loved each other, we were very close, and we don't know what happened, and that's sort of, to a point, it's irritating in a sense that as I say that the fight I pick up with Aga Shahid Ali is that what happened, you know why we came, and I mean, I'm not looking for an apology from any of you in particular, but don't wonder about what happened, etc. It's sort of really embarrassing. But generally, for this book, when I met people, it was with a lot of warmth, and it was with such love. They opened. All you had to do was have chai with them, which they would insist on, and then you sat and you chat, and suddenly they would just not stop talking. They had so much to say, and if you were a good listener, it was just hard to get down all that information. All it took was, it didn't even matter who I was. I think a lot of people didn't even know whether I'm a Kashmiri Pandit or a Muslim. I think a lot of them felt that I was. Some of them could look at my face and say, and instinctively start speaking in Kashmiri. But to some of them, they thought perhaps I was somebody from mainland, from UP or wherever. And they just opened up to me, and I could have been anyone, and they just spoke to me at length. It was very warm. With military and all, I didn't have to get involved with this book in the course of this book as such, but otherwise it is how it is. It's sort of, I mean, as a journalist, it's sort of, it is.
Yeah, I can imagine. Thanks, Suhaash. I think we have kind of run out of time, but we will have some audience questions, of course. And before I move on to the audience questions, I wanted to just ask, what does this mark your transition into full-time writing, and what is the next book that you're thinking about?
I would so much want to immediately begin the next book, but this book was, I had to put this out partly in order to make a point that I could write on, since I had been boasting about writing a book ever since I got into journalism, but partly mainly to assure myself that my dreams weren't misplaced, that I could write a sort of a half decent book, and I could pull this one off. So ideally I would like to get on writing the next book, but then I think I need to pause for a second and just this time, sort of, now that I know that I can sort of do this time, maybe put in more effort and read more, study more, travel more, because this I was doing with a job. Now I would like to take more time with it, and so I would, but I have some sort of fleeting ideas. I don't know if they'll turn into book, but I have some ideas, but I think I'd sort of wait and pause and let this chew on this for some time. Thank you so much for talking to me. Thank you so much for taking time.
Thanks, Suhaash. I really enjoyed that. But before I let you go, there are some audience questions. Preeti, how would you like to do this? Should I?
Yeah, I
read
think
them out
that
or should
Bani,
I-
maybe you can ask the questions because there are 4 or 5 that I can see in the chat box.
Right.
And also earlier, I think Sarabjot Pahel had written a poem that he's written on Kashmir. So if you would like him to read it or anything else, or just ask him to talk about it later, maybe. And the book again, please do order. It's really worth your while, gives you a completely different insight into Kashmir and the people there. So basically people's lives. It's a travelogue about places, but more about people and how places impact people. So please order.
So yeah, maybe we could begin with the poem on Kashmir and then move on to some of the questions that people have asked.
So can I request Dr. Sarabjot to please come and recite that poem? Dr. Sarabjot, are you there? Please unmute yourself.
And there may be some.
Dr. Behel, please, can you unmute yourself? Yeah. He's
No.
coming.
Yes. Okay. I just put it out there so that everyone can read it, but I think every time I'm asked to read the poem in my own voice, but I'll do that. So can I see here the poem, because I always have to refer to, you know, what is it? Okay, the poem is called Wadi Ka Ghar. So it's house in the valley. It goes like this: fireplace ki jal bujhi raak, बर्फ से ढकी छत की चिमनी से धुएं की लकीर आसमां की ओर उठी है, जैसे सफेद चादर से ढके बदन के जर्द मुंह से आखिरी सांस निकली, पीछे ठंडा यख बदन छोड़कर, कोई रोने वाला नहीं, कोई ढोने वाला नहीं, सफेद कफन पे चिनार के पत्ते गिर रहे. So that's the end of the first poem. There's another one which is very small. याद रखना ये वादी है, हर गूंज हर चीख टकरा कर वापस तुम्हारी तरफ ही लौटेगी, दोगुनी चौगुनी होकर. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bell.
And Bani, if you allow me,
yeah,
I have also written something about the feelings when the Article 370 was abrogated. And if you allow me, can I, Suhas, can I recite it?
Please, sir.
And it says like, कि वो तेरे शहर का कानून क्या अजीब था. And just, you know, एक second में सब कुछ बदल गया. वो तेरे शहर का कानून क्या अजीब था, मिला भी वो मुझसे तो फासले दरमियान रखकर. हो रही थी गुफ्तगू, मुख्तसर था फलसफा, अजब थी खामोशियां, हर आह की तासीर थी, नम चश्म थे और सांसें थमी हुई. कानूने शहर अजीब था, चमक गले मिला वो मुझसे भी तो फासले दरमियान रखकर. तेरे शहर का कानून अजीब था, मिला भी वो मुझसे तो फासले दरमियान रखकर.
फलसफा शुरू में मुख्तसर नहीं था, वो धीरे धीरे फिर हुआ जैसे. I mean, as soon as people, it sort of took time for them to understand कि मतलब क्या हो रहा है, ना, to sort of really absorb. Because I mean, I'm sort of just saying whether it's not a. मैं सिर्फ आपको ये बता रहा था कि जैसे वो थोड़ा वक्त लगा ना समझने में कि हुआ क्या अचानक से ये सब. तो it was very beautifully written.
Thank you.
Thank you, Arvinder ji. So I'll just read out a couple of questions and then you can pick and choose between them or answer them all if you feel like. So Dr. Bell asks that, do you feel a sense of rootlessness and how you deal with it? Sangamitra Malik asks, what happens to the homes that were vacated by Kashmiri Pandits 1990 onwards? And then Gurdesh sir asked about that you don't much write about the political views of Kashmir and whether that is a conscious choice and is it politically not correct to talk about it? So maybe we could take some of those.
I'll quickly answer. No, I don't feel rootless. I feel very firmly rooted to the place. There was a question about political opinions. So I didn't go into it because then you can't ever get out of that, because there's more context, there's more history than there is the present. There are just dates. There's sort of 1950, 1970, what happened there and what happened. So and then Nehru said what at Lal Chowk, and Pakistan didn't honor some promise, and you can't get out of that spiral. And every political statement has books worth of context. So if you include anything, I included it isn't an apolitical book in a sense that, I mean, I'm not talking of party politics, but there is politics. For instance, there's a widow who's lost her son, and she says that मतलब मैं इस आज़ादी का क्या करूँगी, वो आज़ादी तो उनके लिए होते हैं ना जो खुश हैं, या मतलब और लोग भी हैं जो इस तरीके की बात कर रहे हैं कि मतलब यहाँ पे तो like there's somebody who says children's magazine editor, he says I think food is the only thing that's unoccupied in Kashmir. You can draw your inferences, but it's not an apolitical book. It's just not a party political book, and there's enough, I think, in there for you to chew on, I suppose. I mean, but it's not a book on contemporary politics. Also, I just wanted to give a flavor of what people in Kashmir are feeling right now.
I would agree with that assessment, Suhas. I think it's a book about very much rooted in politics, but in politics of the everyday and really from the bottom up of how people engage in experience rather than a top-down discourse on what politics is or is supposed to be. Sanjay Hazarika asks that how are people dealing with angst, anguish, and a sense of loss and PTSS or PTSD?
I don't know. I mean, you don't even have enough psychiatrists in Kashmir, and in that 1 year, when you cut off internet, you cut off the only source of information for people. Students there couldn't apply. Doctors had a hard time consulting their colleagues in other parts of the world. And for a lot of people, it was very essential to keep themselves engaged with something they couldn't. Kashmir is short of psychiatrists also. I don't know, really, very quite frankly. It's unimaginable the sort of how Kashmiris feel sequestered and alone, and then encounters keep breaking out all over the place, and there are further clampdowns, and then there is a tourist season in the middle of pandemic. I don't know, it's sort of a very difficult spot to be in. I don't know how they deal with, only a person living in Kashmir can tell you, but it's very, very tough to be living in Kashmir right now, is what I can say.
One last question from Sangamitra Malik, who asks, how is the relationship between Kashmiri Muslims and Kashmiri Pandits living in Kashmir today?
I think this question is better answered if one takes one-on-one personal relationships, only answers it in that context, because community-wise, I suppose the mistrust will never be overcome. There will always remain great mistrust, but there are very great friendships one-on-one between Kashmiri Pandits and Kashmiri Muslims. I, for one, have very, very close Kashmiri Muslim friends. And this is how it is. One-on-one we have, but it's hard to say anything when you talk about communities, because it's just, I do not want to be speaking on behalf of any particular group of people. So it's great one-on-one, I mean, is what I can say.
Right, I would agree with that assessment. And I think to hear more about how everyday people engage and deal with each other, I urge everybody to really get a copy of the book and see for themselves the wonderful narratives that Suhas has been able to collect and put forward in such a kind of poignant way. With that, maybe we've run out of time, but Preeti, would you like to do the conclusion perhaps? I'm not, somebody else from the Moja.
I'm going to ask, I'll ask Gurpratap to do the conclusion. I just found your remarks on violence really quite amazing. This, of course, it's true about the dehumanizing and deadening and also in a way increasing appetite, just like you do for pornography, which you mentioned. But I find that really quite telling and quite horrible kind of facet to the human mind anyway. And also what you just described about what people there are living through, because it sounds almost like being, in this kind of schizophrenic, broken up and fractured world that you're confronting all the time.
I mean, there was this mother I met who I was speaking to, and suddenly she got a call from her daughter, and her daughter had some traumatic experiences living in Kashmir, and this Kashmiri Pandit woman, she said that my daughter can't go to sleep unless I sing a lullaby to her every night, and she sees my face on video call. I can't imagine what the daughter and the mother went through in that 1 year of lockdown. I mean, there's this, if you're really perverse and full of hatred, you'll say that some people deserved it. But are there just very different sort of people living in? It's not like you're punishing one set of people, even if that is the goal. It's just so many people are suffering, and you don't know what sort of suffering you're causing to people.
Exactly. I think Sanjay has written here that kind of comparison with what went on in Nagaland, Mizoram, Manipur, Assam, all of those places in the 50s and later. So yeah, of course, all over. And now you have, what you were saying earlier about having returned from Bastar and so on. So I mean, these are ongoing things. I think we could have another session on that. But I mean, I'm going to leave it to Gurpratap, and I hope he has found the poem he was looking for from Gulzar. Chaliye, aap conclude.
Thank you, Preeti. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I would like, on behalf of Maja House, I would like to thank both Suhas, you, and Bani for joining us today for this wonderful, wonderful and eye-opening session on Kashmir. The thing about Kashmir is that when we think about it, idea कि जन्नत है जन्नत है जन्नत है और यहीं पे है, that somehow romanticizes the whole image of Srinagar and Kashmir for us, and we somehow forget that there is an actual real hard life going on somewhere away from the Dal Lake, the mountains, the snow, Gulmarg and Sonamarg, sorry. And your book sounds just to do that. It looks as if it is looking at the other side of Kashmir, without stripping it of all the false romanticism that we associate with it. But before I go any further, I also have a question that you are a Kashmiri Pandit. And when you went back to Kashmir to do this book, to do your research and to travel, did you feel like an outsider? And did it affect the objectivity of your book also? Your point of view? Could you make it objective? Because if you see people like Vishal Bhardwaj made that movie, Heather, it was based in Srinagar and Kashmir and all the violence. And the fair square problem was the army in his movie.
I don't pretend to be an objective person, and I think objectivity is an enemy in such a situation, because one necessarily goes to places of conflict with a certain bias. I may not even have been born in Kashmir. I may have been somewhere else, but I go to a place with a certain set of morals, and I look at Kashmir through that morality. Of course, I wasn't even attempting to be objective at all, but I was trying to include a diverse set of voices that gave you a sense of how vibrant the place is, and how it was often debating with itself, and so on and so forth. And I am a Kashmiri Pandit, yes, and when I went there, I don't know. I mean, what I do have a few pages in which I say that I have some issues with when we discuss conflict and all. I have some issues which I mentioned. For instance, the circumstances in which we left aren't often acknowledged. So I don't know. I think I don't know. Have I answered your question?
Yeah. So thank you so much for this session. And before I conclude today's session, I would like to introduce all of you to our forthcoming programs in the month of April. Next week, on the 10th of April,
no problem.
I think we are going to the border of Delhi. And we are going to be talking about the chronicler of the departed, deaths at the sites of farmer protest, which is a conversation with Anurup Kaur, Simi Varaj, and Amandeep Sandhu. Then, following that, on the April 17th, which is again a Saturday, we have this session on Midnight's Borders, A People's History of Modern India. It is a conversation between author Suchitra Vijayan and Annie Zaidi. And then on, I think, April 24th, we are talking about fugitives in the UK. That should be pretty interesting for everyone. Escaped, True Stories of Indian Fugitives in London, a conversation between authors Ruhi Khan, Danish Khan, and Pooja Changoyewala. And we will end on the 30th with a session. We'll end it with a grand session on The Last Queen, the story of Rani Jinda, which is a conversation between author Chitra Banerjee, Devakura Karuni, and Mandira Nayyar. So please do join us for more such scintillating programs, and do keep on sending your feedbacks also, so we can also curate programs according to your requirements and needs and wishes, whatever you want to hear. But before we conclude today's session, I would like to take this opportunity once again to thank you, Suhas, for your wonderful book. I've already placed the order.
I'll wait to hear your views on the book.
And I'll wait for you to meet you so you can sign the book.
Sure. I'm waiting to meet Preeti, and Bani has been so terribly kind. I can't thank her enough for sort of hosting this thing, and Preeti has been such a lovely person, organizing, sort of doing all the. Thank you so much. And
Thanks,
I
Suhas.
can't.
And in Delhi, I will also get my book signed.
You're
Anyway, I really enjoyed
kind.
reading it. So thank you very much. And
You're very kind. Thank you.
Thank you, Suhas. Thank you once again.
Thank you.
Thanks, Suhas, and thanks,
much.
Maja. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.